the shadow of Nazi-occupied Europe, a young Jewish woman named Chajka Grossman risked everything to keep the flame of resistance alive. Disguised, hunted, and armed only with courage, she crossed ghetto walls and enemy lines, carrying not just secret messages, but the fragile hope of an entire people's survival. Under the freezing gray skies of Nazi-occupied Poland, a whisper moved through the crumbling ghettos. A whisper carried by a young woman whose name few knew, but whose presence could ignite courage where only despair remained. Chajka Grossman was born in 1919 in Białystok, a vibrant Polish city that once pulsed with Jewish life. Before the war, the streets of Białystok echoed with the sound of Yiddish songs, the calls of merchants, and the laughter of children running past the textile factories that powered the city's economy. For a young woman like Chajka, the future seemed uncertain but full of possibility. She was drawn early into the world of activism and idealism, joining the Socialist Zionist youth movement, DROR. It was there that her sense of purpose took root, a belief that the Jewish people must fight not only for survival, but for dignity and freedom. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the world she knew vanished overnight. Białystok fell first under Soviet occupation, and Chajka, along with many other young activists, continued her underground organizing in secret. But in June 1941, as German forces turned against their Soviet allies and swept into the eastern territories, the fragile calm shattered. The Nazis entered Białystok with calculated terror. Within days, the city's Jewish population faced mass executions, public burnings, and forced roundups. The Białystok Ghetto was established that August, sealing tens of thousands behind barbed wire, brick walls, and watchtowers. Inside those suffocating boundaries, Grossman's life became a test of endurance and courage. The German occupiers imposed starvation rations, random killings, and slave labor. Families were torn apart as transports left daily for extermination camps. Yet even in this horror, resistance began to take shape. Young people gathered secretly in cellars, attics, and abandoned workshops. They shared news from the outside world, smuggled in pamphlets, and whispered of fighting back. Chajka was among them, one of the first to understand that survival alone would not be enough. By 1942, she had joined the leadership of the underground resistance that operated under the name of the anti-fascist bloc. Her role was perilous. She became a courier, a messenger between ghettos. That meant traveling under false identity papers, posing as a non-Jewish Polish woman, moving between cities infested with Gestapo checkpoints and informers. Each journey carried the risk of death. She transported not only letters and reports, but weapons, medical supplies, and the messages that bound scattered resistance groups together. Her routes stretched across the heart of Nazi-controlled territory, from Białystok to Vilna, Grodno, Warsaw, and the forests where partisans gathered strength. In Warsaw, she met other legendary figures of the underground, like Mordecai Anielewicz and Zivia Lubitkin, who were laying the foundations of what would later become the Jewish Fighting Organization. They shared intelligence, exchanged contacts, and discussed the impossible how to fight an empire built on extermination. Chajka's small frame and quiet demeanor often made her invisible to the German eye. She moved through train stations crowded with soldiers, her forged Aryan papers hidden inside her clothes, her satchel carrying coded reports written in invisible ink. A single mistake, a wrong accent, a glance of fear could mean instant execution. Yet she kept going, again and again, threading through occupied Poland like a lifeline between the doomed ghettos. She learned to memorize entire pages of reports in case her materials were seized. She smuggled grenades and pistols disassembled in bundles of rags. She carried medical supplies hidden in bread loaves, and messages sewn into the hems of her dresses. Every delivery connected isolated resistance cells and allowed them to coordinate actions across the country. She was not only a messenger of information but of morale. When she entered a ghetto, people knew that the outside world had not forgotten them, that others were still fighting. In late 1942, the reality of mass extermination became undeniable. The deportations from Warsaw to Treblinka, from Białystok to Auschwitz, revealed the full scale of Nazi intentions. Chajka's missions grew even more dangerous. She began to move with members of the underground press, helping distribute bulletins that told the truth of the camps to the remaining Jewish populations. Her courage became legendary among the resistance fighters. She was not armed with a rifle or grenades most of the time, yet her presence was often worth an entire battalion's strength. In early 1943, word spread through the underground that the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising was being prepared. The idea of armed resistance, once thought suicidal, had become inevitable. Chajka was tasked with carrying reports from Warsaw back to Białystok, encouraging the fighters there to prepare for their own uprising. She crossed territories teeming with German patrols, and yet she reached her city alive. When she returned to Białystok, she found a ghetto already on the edge of revolt. The people were starving, the deportations constant, but the will to resist had hardened. On August 16, 1943, the Białystok Ghetto erupted in rebellion. The Jewish fighters, poorly armed but fiercely determined, launched a desperate assault against the German and Ukrainian forces surrounding them. Chajka served as one of the communication links between the bunkers, coordinating messages among the groups as gunfire and explosions tore through the streets. The resistance lasted for several days before being crushed. Hundreds were killed in battle. Thousands more were captured and sent to Treblinka and Majdank. But for those brief moments, they had defied their fate. Grossman managed to escape before the final roundup, fleeing through a hidden passage that led beyond the ghetto walls into the forests of northeastern Poland. In the dense woods that covered the region, she found the remnants of partisan units, Jews and non-Jews alike, who had taken up arms against the Germans. Among them were survivors from the Białystok Ghetto, including commanders from her underground group. Life in the forest was brutal. Supplies were scarce, winters unforgiving, and betrayal always a possibility. Yet Chajka continued her mission, linking the partisan camps with what remained of urban resistance networks. She helped organize supply routes, coordinated intelligence, and sometimes participated in sabotage operations against German convoys. The forests of Belarus and eastern Poland became her new battlefield. At night, fires flickered between the trees as partisan fighters shared fragments of news. Allied landings, Soviet advances, the slow collapse of the Nazi front. She carried that hope from one camp to another, ensuring that isolated fighters knew they were part of something larger. When the Red Army began its offensive in 1944, Grossman and her comrades emerged from the woods to see the shattered ruins of their cities once again. Białystok lay in devastation, its Jewish population almost entirely annihilated. From more than 40,000 before the war, fewer than 2,000 survived. As liberation spread, Chajka returned to her city, walking through empty streets where once her family had lived. Her parents and siblings were gone, lost to the machinery of death. Yet even in that desolation, she refused to collapse. She joined efforts to rebuild the Jewish community, helping survivors locate each other, collecting testimonies, and documenting what had happened. Her knowledge of underground communication networks became invaluable to post-war relief efforts. She also began writing reports on the resistance for historical archives, determined that the story of those who had fought would not disappear. In the following years, she emigrated to what would become the State of Israel. There, her life took a new form, but not a quieter one. She entered politics, joining the Mapam party, and was later elected to the Israeli Knesset, where she served for more than a decade. Her speeches often carried the same conviction that had once driven her through the ghettos, that memory must be an act of resistance, that justice and humanity are inseparable. She fought for social issues, education, and the recognition of Holocaust survivors and resistance fighters as heroes, not victims. Even as the world around her moved on, Chajka never forgot the faces of those who had fallen. The couriers who vanished on their missions, the children who carried grenades in their pockets, the mothers who hid messages beneath braid. She often described herself not as a hero, but as a link in a chain forged by necessity and faith. Each of her missions during the war had been an act of defiance against a regime that sought to erase not only lives but also memory. Her work also helped historians piece together the web of Jewish resistance that had spanned across occupied Europe. The image of the Jewish population as passive victims was slowly replaced by the recognition of widespread, organized defiance. Chajka Grossman's life stood as one of the most vivid examples of that truth. She had been one of the few women couriers whose missions covered such vast distances and who survived to tell the tale. In the ghettos, women like her had often been underestimated by the Nazis. Their appearance allowed them to slip through checkpoints. Their courage allowed them to face interrogations without breaking. The Germans could not imagine that a quiet, ordinary-looking young woman could carry coded messages, smuggle pistols, and coordinate revolts. That blindness became her greatest weapon. Through the years after the war, Grossman worked tirelessly to ensure that the stories of female couriers were preserved. She gave testimony to Yad Vashem and other institutions, recounting her journeys and naming those who had not returned. Her words carried the weight of a generation that had witnessed the abyss and chosen to fight back. She lived long enough to see the survivors of the ghettos and camps build new lives in Israel and beyond. Yet the shadow of Białystok and the faces of those lost never left her. In her later years, she often returned to Poland as part of memorial delegations. Standing in the empty squares where the ghetto once stood, she would walk slowly, touching the stones, as if they still whispered the voices of the resistance. The rebuilt streets bore no trace of the walls or bunkers where her comrades had fought, but she remembered every corner. Her presence there was a living bridge between the past and the present, between loss and endurance. When Chajka Grossman passed away in 1996, she left behind not only the legacy of her wartime deeds, but the enduring idea that resistance takes many forms. Her courage had not been measured in battles won, but in messages delivered, in lives connected, in the fragile hope she carried through the heart of darkness. Today her story stands as one of the most extraordinary examples of moral strength in an age of despair. The ghettos she once crossed are now memorials, their silence a reminder of the cost of hatred and the power of human defiance. In archives and testimonies, her name appears alongside those of other resistance leaders, but her role remains singular, a messenger whose courage moved invisibly through the veins of a dying world, keeping its heart beating just a little longer. Each journey she made under false papers, each whispered password exchanged in a hidden cellar, each narrow escape from the Gestapo, carried the same message across time, that courage can exist even in absolute darkness. Her life is not a legend. It is a record of the choices made when hope itself becomes an act of rebellion. When historians speak of Jewish resistance, they often mention the armed uprisings, the partisans, the sabotage missions. But in truth, the foundation of all those efforts was built by people like Chajka Grossman, the couriers who connected the isolated sparks of defiance into a network that could endure. Without them, there would have been no coordination, no sharing of information, no uprising at all. They were the nervous system of the underground, invisible yet essential. In the final years of her life, she once reflected that the war had taught her a single lesson, that even when the world seems entirely broken, one person's courage can carry more than words. It can carry life itself. Those who watched her walk through the streets of Białystok decades later saw not a survivor, but a living continuation of the resistance. She had once carried hope across borders, under the shadow of death. Now she carried memory across generations under the light of peace. In the story of Chajka Grossman, history finds one of its rarest forms of heroism, quiet, steadfast, and unstoppable. She never commanded armies or wrote manifestos, yet she changed the course of lives through the strength of her will. From the ghettos of Białystok to the forests of the partisans, From the ashes of war to the halls of the Knesset, her journey traces the path of defiance that refused to die. And through her, the message still endures. That even in the darkest of times, there are those who carry light, not for themselves, but for everyone who cannot. After the war ended, and the fires of Europe's destruction cooled into the silence of ruins, Chajka Grossman found herself among the countless displaced who wandered through a continent that no longer resembled the one they had known. The liberation of Poland did not bring peace to those who had survived the ghettos and the forests. It brought the crushing realization of what had been lost. Entire families, neighborhoods, and traditions had vanished. Of the thriving Jewish community of Białystok that had once numbered over 40,000, only a few hundred remained. The streets where children had once played were now empty, the synagogues destroyed, the synagogues desecrated. Grossman moved through the remnants of her city, like someone walking through memory made flesh, recognizing corners of buildings and fragments of walls where people she had known had fought and died. She quickly became involved in the rebuilding of communal structures for the survivors. With her experience in underground organization, she helped create committees that documented testimonies, located missing persons, and assisted those returning from concentration camps. Many of the survivors arrived broken, starved and speechless, unable to describe the horrors they had witnessed. Grossman listened to them with the same patience she had once shown as a courier, collecting their words and names, helping to record what had happened in places like Treblinka, Auschwitz, and Majdanek. The Survivors Committee in Białystok became one of the first efforts to gather evidence for future war crimes trials. In the chaos of post-war Poland, the political landscape shifted quickly. The Soviet-backed authorities began consolidating power, and Jewish survivors were caught between gratitude for liberation and fear of new repression. Anti-Semitic violence did not end with the fall of the Nazis. In many towns across Poland, returning Jews were attacked by local militias and mobs. Grossman herself faced danger once more, this time not from German soldiers, but from the instability that followed in their wake. She joined a network helping Jewish survivors escape Poland through the so-called Bricka movement, a clandestine route leading refugees toward Palestine via Czechoslovakia and Austria. The routes were treacherous, crossing guarded borders and minefields, but the desire for a homeland where Jews could live without persecution burned stronger than ever. By 1946, Grossman was fully engaged in the bridge's operations. She helped organize transports, obtained forged travel documents, and negotiated with local authorities. The skills that had once allowed her to navigate Nazi checkpoints now helped her guide survivors through occupied zones, patrolled by Allied and Soviet forces. In those years, tens of thousands of Jewish refugees through the secret paths of the Bridge network. Each group that reached safety represented a small victory against the annihilation that had consumed Europe. In 1948, as the State of Israel declared independence, Chajka Grossman joined the waves of immigrants, arriving from the shattered landscapes of Europe. The ship that carried her to Haifa harbor was filled with refugees from across the continent, many still bearing the tattoos of concentration camps on their arms. The sight of the coastline stirred emotions she could barely contain. For the first time, she was entering a land not as a fugitive but as a free woman. Yet even there, her mission did not end. The new state was struggling for survival, facing invasion from surrounding countries within days of its declaration. Grossman volunteered in local defense efforts and in social programs for Holocaust survivors who had arrived with nothing. She settled in the northern town of Kfar Blum, one of the kibbutzim established by the socialist movements to which she had belonged before the war. Life on the kibbutz was harsh, defined by agricultural labor, long days, and the collective spirit of rebuilding. But for Grossman, it represented continuity, a community founded on ideals of cooperation and resistance to despair. Her leadership qualities soon became apparent. She was appointed to positions within the Histadrut, Israel's General Federation of Labor, and later became active in the political party Mapam, which drew many members from the same socialist youth movements that had fought in the ghettos. Through Mapam, she began advocating for the rights of women, workers, and Holocaust survivors. She was known for her calm determination, her clear voice, and her insistence that those who had suffered should not be silenced or forgotten. During the 1950s, Israel was absorbing hundreds of thousands of migrants from Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East. The young state was under enormous strain. Its economy fragile, its infrastructure unfinished, its society divided by language and culture. Grossman's work focused on integrating Holocaust survivors into the social fabric, providing education, housing, and employment for those who had lost everything. She worked with youth organizations to teach the next generation about the resistance during the war, emphasizing that Jewish history included both suffering and courage. In 1969, she was elected to the Knesset, Israel's parliament, as a representative of the Mapam party. For her, entering the Knesset was not merely a political achievement. It was the continuation of the same struggle she had begun as a young woman, carrying secret messages through the ghettos. Inside the marble halls of the parliament, she spoke not with the tone of rhetoric, but with the voice of experience. Her speeches often drew from her own memories, describing the underground networks, the children of the ghettos, and the women couriers who would risk everything to preserve a sense of humanity. During her time in office, she served on committees dealing with education, labor, and welfare. She advocated for policies that recognized the psychological and social needs of Holocaust survivors, who often lived in poverty and isolation. She pushed for public housing projects, better healthcare, and pensions for aging partisans and resistance fighters. Her quiet persistence earned her respect across political lines. Even those who disagreed with her socialist ideals recognized the authenticity of her commitment. Grossman also became a key figure in preserving the historical record of Jewish resistance during the Holocaust. She collaborated with institutions like Yad Vashem and the Ghetto Fighters' House Museum, contributing testimonies and helping to collect documents from former fighters scattered across the world. Many of the archives that historians later used to reconstruct the story of the Białystok Ghetto Uprising came from materials she helped to secure. She maintained correspondence with other survivors of the resistance, including Zivia Lubitkin and Yitzhak Zuckerman, sharing recollections that would later appear in memoirs and documentaries. In her personal life, she married and became a mother, but the shadow of war never truly left her. Those who knew her described her as composed yet distant, her eyes often reflecting a world far beyond the one she stood in. She rarely spoke about her own pain, but was relentless in ensuring that the pain of others was acknowledged. When former resistance members struggled to obtain official recognition for their contributions, she fought on their behalf. She understood that their stories were not only personal, but foundational to the identity of the new nation. The passage of time did not diminish her connection to Poland. Throughout the 1970s and 1980s, she returned several times as part of Israeli delegations commemorating the destruction of the Jewish communities. In Białystok, she walked again through the streets where her underground meetings had taken place, where friends had died, and where the ghetto's final battle had been fought. The city was rebuilt, its modern buildings covering the scars of the past, yet she could still trace in her mind the invisible map of the old ghetto. The hidden passageways, the workshops, the courtyards where whispers of resistance had once moved like breath through the night. Her return visits were not only personal pilgrimages but acts of testimony. She met with Polish officials, educators, and young people, urging them to preserve the memory of the Jewish communities that had once shaped the city's culture. She participated in ceremonies, marking the anniversaries of the uprising, standing beside survivors and descendants of those who had perished. Each visit was a bridge across time, connecting the ashes of the past to the living world. In Israel, Her political career continued through multiple terms in the Knesset. She remained a voice for social justice, equality, and the recognition of women's contributions in all spheres of life. Her wartime experience had taught her that courage and leadership often emerged where they were least expected, and she used her platform to highlight the stories of women who had served as fighters, nurses, and couriers during the Holocaust and Israel's early years. She argued that history should record their roles not as exceptions, but as integral to the collective struggle. As she aged, Grossman withdrew from daily politics but remained active in public life. She contributed to Holocaust education programs, speaking at schools, military academies, and universities. Her lectures were not marked by drama but by clarity and precision. She spoke of the underground press, of the coded signals used by couriers, of the ways messages were hidden inside clothing, or written in lemon juice to appear only under heat. Students listening to her often found themselves transported to another time, imagining the world she described in such detail. In the final decade of her life, she worked on compiling her memories and records into written form, ensuring that the facts she had carried for decades would not fade. She also provided testimony for oral history projects that sought to preserve first-hand accounts before they were lost to time. Her voice, steady and deliberate, conveyed both the horror and the humanity of what she had seen. The recognition she received during her lifetime was significant, but never the focus of her attention. She was awarded honors for her contributions to the resistance and to Israeli society, yet she often redirected praise toward those who had not lived to see freedom. Her perspective remained anchored in the collective memory of her generation. The youth of the ghettos who had chosen to fight when the world had already written them off as doomed. As the 20th century drew to a close, Chajka Grossman stood as one of the last living links between the resistance of the ghettos and the modern state that had emerged from the ashes of Europe. Her death in 1996 marked the end of an era, but her influence endured through the institutions she had helped to shape and the memories she had preserved. At her funeral, attended by survivors, politicians, and young students, the stories of her wartime missions were retold, not as legend but as living history. In the years following her passing, her name became synonymous with the courage of the couriers, the women who had carried messages, weapons, and hope through the labyrinth of Nazi-occupied Europe. Streets, schools, and memorials were named in her honor in both Israel and Poland. Exhibits dedicated to the Jewish resistance often included photographs of her, sometimes in uniform, sometimes in civilian clothes, her expression calm and unreadable. Documents bearing her handwriting were displayed in museums, fragments of the same clandestine world she had once risked her life to sustain. Her story continues to echo in classrooms and memorial ceremonies, where the lessons of the past are retold to each new generation. The ghettos she once traversed are now marked by stones and plaques, their outlines traced on city pavements where commuters pass daily without realizing the history beneath their feet. Yet within archives and testimonies, her footsteps remain, leading from one doomed city to another, connecting them with invisible threads of defiance. Those who study her life today find in it a narrative that spans the extremes of human experience, from the organized murder of a people to the birth of a nation determined to survive. Every stage of her journey reflects the virginity of purpose that defined her, from the underground networks of occupied Poland to the parliamentary debates of a young democracy. She served the same cause, the preservation of human dignity in the face of destruction. Her legacy endures not through monuments but through the written and spoken word. The reports she carried during the war, the testimonies she gathered afterward, and the policies she helped enact all form part of a continuum of remembrance. Each detail adds depth to the broader history of resistance, revealing the complexity of a struggle often reduced to simple narratives. When historians trace the survival of Jewish identity and resistance during the Holocaust, they return repeatedly to figures like Chajka Grossman, not because she sought glory, but because her life demonstrates the power of individual will harnessed to collective purpose. Her work bridged the silence between the ghettos and the free world, between the dead and the living, between memory and history. The story of her later years, though quieter than the thunder of war, remains equally vital. Through her service in Israel's Knesset, her advocacy for survivors, her documentation of resistance, and her return journeys to Poland, she completed the circle of her mission. The messages she once carried across burning cities became lessons carried across generations. And in that unbroken chain, her voice still speaks, not as a symbol, but as a witness who lived, fought, and remembered so that the truth would never be lost. As the century turned, the traces of Chajka Grossman's life remained deeply woven into the memory of two nations: Poland, where her story began in the resistance, and Israel, where her struggle transformed into rebuilding. Her legacy lived not only in the official records of wartime defiance, but in the quieter archives of ordinary people whose lives she had touched. Former couriers and fighters who had once followed her coded instructions in the ghettos now lived across continents, yet many still carried small scraps of paper with her handwriting, remnants of the resistance network she had held together. In Israel, survivors she had helped resettle spoke of her as a steady presence during the years of uncertainty, the one who bridged the language of the underground with the vocabulary of nationhood. By the mid-1990s, Grossman's health began to fail, but her commitment to education and remembrance never diminished. She gave her final testimonies to the ghetto fighter's house, recording the details of routes, passwords, and names that had never appeared in official reports. She described the couriers who had vanished mid-journey, the bunkers beneath the streets of Białystok, the faces of children carrying grenades in school satchels. Each recollection was delivered with precision, as if she were still preparing a dispatch that needed to reach its destination intact. Her final years were spent surrounded by books, letters, and visitors who came to hear her speak. Young historians and soldiers from the Israel Defense Forces often sought her out, eager to understand how resistance could exist under total occupation. To each, she offered the same lesson, not through speeches, but through recollection. She spoke of the coded signals used by messengers crossing ghetto borders, of the risks taken by ordinary civilians who offered shelter, and of the small acts of defiance that given meaning to life under tyranny. On January 26, 1996, one day before International Holocaust Remembrance Day, Chajka Grossman died in Tel Aviv at the age of 76. News of her passing spread through Israel's newspapers and was carried on radio broadcasts that recounted her journey from the ghettos of Białystok to the Knesset chamber. Former partisans, political colleagues, and young students attended her funeral. Among them were fellow survivors who had once fought beside her, their ranks now few, their memories bound by the same struggle. In Białystok, memorial ceremonies that year included her name alongside those of the ghetto fighters who had perished in 1943. The city she had once traversed under curfew now bore a plaque in her honor, marking the site of the uprising she had helped coordinate. In Israel, institutions dedicated to Holocaust education added her biography to their archives, preserving the testimony of one of the most daring couriers of the resistance. The story of Chajka Grossman endures in classrooms, museums, and commemorations across the world. Her life traced the full arc of 20th-century Jewish history, from annihilation to resistance, from displacement to nationhood. Through her, the silent corridors of the ghettos and the secret paths of the partisans became connected to the living memory of freedom. Her journey closed where it began, in the enduring act of carrying a message forward, across time, across borders, across generations.